Welcome. This is a very special session because we are honoring one of SIG Chi's 2007 award winners. So I'm really feel very privileged to be here and introduce our speaker for this plenary session. I first want to take a moment to say something about the Social Impact Award, which is the award that Gregory Abowd received and the one for which we have the privilege of hearing this presentation in a few moments. The ACM SIG Chi Social Impact Award is the newest award in a collection of awards that recognize the truly outstanding members of our community, those among us who are making a huge difference in a variety of ways. And in particular, this award, the Social Impact Award, is given to individuals who promote the application of human-computer interaction research to pressing social needs. And Gregory Abowd is one of the two winners of this year's award, and he brings to the community achievements in an area of what we, as SIG Chi, recognize as an area of intense strategic importance. Gregory Abowd is professor in the School of Interactive Computing and a faculty member at the GVU Center at Georgia Tech. He is founder and co-director of the Aware Home Research Initiative and is Associate Director for the Health Systems Institute at Georgia Tech. Over the past 4 years, motivated by his own family situation dealing with multiple children with developmental disabilities, he has become an active researcher and advocate for the use of information technologies to support the needs of individuals with developmental disabilities. He serves on the board of directors of the Autism Society of America, Greater Georgia Chapter, and as an advisor for the Innovative Technologies for Autism Committee, originally with the Cure Autism Now Foundation, and now part of the Autism Speaks Foundation. He is also the co-founder of an Atlanta area nonprofit organization that provides career services to adults on the autism spectrum. Congratulations, Gregory, as your colleague and your friend. I am so proud of you and this award.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't quite feel nervous enough standing in front of you, so I need you to help me a little bit. You can see we're in a venue that is at one time was a sports venue, and it's always been my fantasy to have to shoot the free throw to win the game at the end of an NBA playoff. So if you would all cooperate by raising your hands to try to distract me, I'm going to poise myself, get ready, and shoot, and win. Thank you. Okay. I did play high school varsity basketball, by the way. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work we've been doing at Georgia Tech and some other places that are trying to use information technologies to try to address a very interesting, complex challenge of developmental disabilities. And I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of the initial motivation, if they will put it up on the screen so that people might see. There we go. My father was an 8mm film enthusiast, and he best known by everyone in our family as always having the camera in front of him at all the family events. And they used to make a lot of fun of him, but when he died in 1998, he left behind a 30-year archive of our family history. And when we were no longer able to share that in the way we had as a family with the old faithful 8mm projector, we had a bit of a quandary in our family, and I decided to take this on as a kind of personal mission to provide some way for my family to share the memories that my dad had so painstakingly put together. And I'm fortunate enough, being a professor at a university, to have lots of students who will do just about anything I ask to do without asking too many questions. And I'm going to highlight here some of the work that Shwetak Patel, who I think is here in the audience, who contributed to a project called the Family Video Archive. And I would love, actually, to give you a live demonstration of it, but it takes too long to load those things. So if you want, at the end of this talk, for me to show embarrassing footage of myself, or preferably any of my relatives, I'm happy to oblige there. And I'm the handsome little fellow on the far right in the picture. No, that's Shwetak, the really handsome one. I'm the one on the far right in the little window. We've developed this tool to allow the viewing of digitized home movies, to annotate them in a kind of semi-automated fashion, and to provide a zooming user interface to allow you to be able to comfortably browse through it. We were motivated by Ben Peterson's work in a similar space with digital still photography, and it was great. But this was not done for any reason that was research motivated. It was because I wanted to have a simple way to be able to share some of the memories of my childhood with the rest of my family and have a cheap way to generate Christmas presents. Thank you, Svetik. For every year to all of my relatives, and it was quite fun to actually have this, and it's now the heirloom in our family, and I hope that I don't lose the digital recording someday. But I want to switch a little bit from that entertainment-based reason why the Family Video Archive was put together and talk to you a little bit about what happened to me one evening when I was transforming my own family movies, my family living in Atlanta, from about 1997 when my first son was born to at that time the year 2002. And I was just transferring video from one format to the next, and I had a TV monitor up to help me see what was being presented so I could make sure everything was going fine. And I came in at one point and I saw a video scene that looks something like this. This is my wife and my oldest son, Aiden, and this is December of 1998 in Chicago.
Hey, Aiden, where's your nose? Close. That's pretty close.
Where's your
He's
nose?
18 months old here.
Where's your mouth? Your mouth? Where's your ears? Oh, don't act like you forgot. Where's your eye?
Can you tell us how old you are?
Oh, 81. Where's your hair, Aiden?
Here's a really cute part.
Yeah, your hair.
Where are your toes?
Again.
Where are your toes? That's right.
Okay, so now I'm going to fast forward 8 months later. This is on a vacation in Hawaii.
Speech?
Can we have Mom down on these
You
sides?
see some physical posturing and some verbal stimming.
Okay.
A general kind of
Mom and Dad.
lack of comfort around his
Well,
mom, which was
mine's
not
Dad.
the case 8 months earlier.
Mom and Dad on each side.
So that's what I saw. And to me, that was fairly shocking. So at the time I was seeing this, my son had already been diagnosed with mild to moderate autistic disorder. At that point, the latter video, he was actually diagnosed about 6 months after that time. But when I went back to look as a parent, I see that 18-month video, and there are some things, if you really know what you're looking for, that are potentially worrying in his reaction. But for the most part, I think many people would say that was a fairly normal reaction for an 18-month-old boy. When I see that second one, and it's probably the case for most people here, you see a very different child. And this was our first son, and we did eventually notice these changes in our son, but certainly not as early as they must have been happening. And so it had me thinking, wow, I spend all my research time trying to figure out how I can make it easier for people to capture live experiences and be able to review them later. And I thought, well, maybe there's some more meaningful application to this. Although I had done it in somewhat meaningful examples before in the classroom, but we looked at many whimsical examples as well. And it just took a whole new meaning for me about what can be done if you instrument the ability to capture things and then allow people to reflect on that information later on in ways that are both pleasing, motivating, but also informative in terms of health information. So now what I'm going to do is to talk to you a little bit about how I came to this particular problem and how I tried to balance what became a very demanding personal and professional schedule against these desires to try to do something significant from a research perspective. So I'm left in this position. I think there are a lot of people out in the audience here who have a lot of these similar kinds of struggles that they try to balance. I was trying to be both a parent and an advocate for 2 special needs children. I showed you evidence for my older son, Aiden. He was diagnosed at the age of 2.5. My son, Blaze, was diagnosed at the age of 3, and we still missed evidence of that, even though we already had a child with special needs. So I've become a parent and an advocate of a special needs child. I want to be a successful researcher, as most people who come to these kinds of conferences want to be. I want to advance my career, publish results, and be able to have accolades that I can be proud of. I want to collaborate with experts who provide relevant expertise. We talk a lot in our community about what it means to be interdisciplinary, but I think often our scope or definition of what it means to be interdisciplinary is too narrow. So I wanted to collaborate with folks who knew very little about what I was doing, so I could bring something to the table, and they knew a lot about things that I didn't know too much about, in this particular case, developmental delay. But also, I'm very proud of the students that I've been able to educate and who have gone out to have their own successful careers. And I understand as a professor who, at the time, I already had tenure. I was a successful researcher. I didn't have to do things to prove to other people that I could be an accomplished researcher, but my students needed to. So if I was going to engage them in working on a problem like this, I was going to have to convince them that not only was it something that was worth doing, but it was something that was going to advance their career. And it's hard to balance those things against each other, but I think just observing that those kinds of tensions exist is the first step. But my response to trying to balance against those kinds of tensions is to first, as many people who know me know, that I use situations of my personal life to serve my research agenda. So I scratch my own itches, and I don't apologize for that at all. And the reason I apologize less for that as I've matured as a researcher is because I firmly believe whenever you pick a real problem, there is real research that can be done, almost whatever your research discipline is. So that you're always going to find something research worthy when you're working on a real problem. And when you work on a real problem that you have a motivation about, you bring to the problem the passion that's necessary to achieve excellence. And then, never think of yourself as the island. And in fact, I'm successful to the extent that I have surrounded myself with people who I think have better skills than I have. So surrounding yourself with excellence is not something that you should avoid, it's something you should strive for. And I think you'll see a lot of examples of the excellence that I've been able to surround myself with when I show you examples of the work that my students and other colleagues have helped to accomplish along these lines. So before I go too much further, I want to make sure we're all on the same page a little bit with respect to autism. I thought I didn't need to give this kind of overview because it has been in the press an awful lot. But when I talk to individuals, they often say to me, you know, I hear a lot about autism, but I don't really know what it means. And there's no way I can, in a day, explain to you what it means to have to live with this day to day. But I'm going to give you an idea of what kinds of challenges there are in the domain of autism. It is a developmental disability, and it's typically described as impacting at least 3 characteristics of an individual. Their ability to use language to communicate, their ability to have social interaction, and their ability to behave in what we consider to be appropriate social standards. So it's those notions of language, socialization, and behavior that define the characteristics of autism. And you will see deficits appear in different ways for different individuals. Usually, autism is diagnosed by the age of 3. In fact, the clinical definition of autism requires that evidence of the behaviors or those dimensions of language, socialization, and behavior appear prior to the age of 3. It's often diagnosed later than that, although with the increased public service campaigns, earlier detection has become a little bit more prevalent. You see a graphic up here that I pulled off the fightingautism.org page just this morning, indicating estimates on the number of individuals in the U.S. under the age of 22, actually between 3 and 22. That's when the school system has to provide services. That's why those ages are relevant. So almost 250,000 people. The amount that it costs the U.S. economy to provide services to these individuals, and the time it will be before another family finds out an official diagnosis of one of their children. Another important thing to understand with autism is that it is a spectrum disorder, which means it has a wide variety of manifestations for individuals. The saying being, if you've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism. I know this to be very true. My 2 boys have the same diagnosis of moderate to severe autistic disorder, and they couldn't be more different in terms of functional behavior or whatever. The thing that really works in favor of the autism community is because it shows no bias to race or socioeconomic status, it afflicts just about any demographic. And what has happened is it's developed a very strong and extremely influential advocacy. So those of you who have heard of the Autism Speaks Foundation that was started about 2 years ago, when the chairman of NBC, chairman and CEO of NBC's grandchild was diagnosed. And he corralled all of his resources and within a very short amount of time raised on the order of $100 million to push toward research in autism. And there are many different examples of that. I personally have received funding from the Cure Autism Now Foundation, which was also a parent-driven organization. The Mind Institute at UC Davis was a parent-driven organization that again generated $100 million to support a research effort of extreme value in this area. So that's one thing going to its advantage. So what I'm going to do now is talk to you about 3 different approaches that we have taken over the last few years to try to address different kinds of concerns with respect to the autism problem. There's one common theme that runs across all 3 of these projects, and that is the notion of automated capture. That's where my hat as a researcher becomes very clear, because I've worked a long time trying to figure out how to instrument a particular environment to automate the capture of whatever's going on in that environment and make it available for people to view later. I'm now going to show you 3 different examples that leverage off that experience. The first one is the Abaris project, and this is one portion of Julie Keen's thesis research. There is a particular form of therapy or intervention in autism that's very popular, performed in schools and in homes. It's called discrete trial therapy, and I'll give you a little bit of a description of what it is. But what we were focusing on here is ways to more seamlessly collect the volumes of data that underlie that particular intervention and support the collaborative decision-making that occurs across a team of therapists, all trying to figure out whether the therapy is working for a particular individual. I won't go into too many details here, and there are a variety of papers that Julie has published over the last few years that talk about the details here. What's important is that it generates loads and loads of data. For me as a parent, that's very encouraging, the fact that there was something left over when therapy was done that I could look at to tell me whether things were going well or not. You see 2 pieces of information up here on the screen. The frontmost image on the upper left-hand corner is showing you a sample of a data sheet from one therapy session that lasts anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. It records information about the success of a child performing particular activities that the therapy is directed at. For each one of those activities, there is a separate graph, and that's shown in the back graphic here, that tries to plot the progress of the child for that program over time. So you can see if it's going up, then the child is improving that skill. If it's going down, the child's not improving. If it's going up and down, there's some variability. And it's that trend data that people look at to try to figure out, is the intervention having any effect on the child? In addition to having a lot of data, there's a lot of discussion that goes on. You typically have a team of 4 to 5 or 6 different therapists who come in once a day to meet with the child and perform the therapy, record the data, and then they gather together every once in a while, maybe once a month, maybe once every 2 weeks, and they talk about what was going on with the therapy in order to determine whether things are progressing okay or not. There's usually a professional who facilitates this discussion, and it's often the case that that professional has never been in the actual therapy with the child, so may have relatively little first-hand experience. And this professional is relying on the reporting of the other therapist to help, so that he or she can help guide the team along. You might have video that's recorded that you would look at. You might have those graphs that I was showing before, or you might have the individual data sheets from a particular session. You might have samples of the child's work that you can take a look at. You might bring the child to the meeting and reenact a particular behavior or program so you can see, you can demonstrate what kinds of reactions the child's having, and the consultant can give you some advice. You might, for the most part, just rely on what you remember from your experiences over the last few weeks and try to relate what you think might be impacting success or lack of success. There are often observations from teachers at school or parents or other people that you might want to bring to fore, so you would know things like if the medication regime has changed, or if there's some other thing going on that might be impacting the child's emotions or performance. Finally, the therapists themselves often write rich, detailed notes about what was going on at the end of a therapy session to try to remind or to communicate to others. And you have all of these artifacts. But it was my observation as a parent that the large part of the artifacts that were used in this discussion was the memory of the therapist there. And they would say things like, oh, gee, you know, I think he didn't have a good day that day, or he always seems to go for the object on the right no matter what I say, or he's not really paying attention, but if I can get him to pay attention, he does well. And whereas that might be true, I'm convinced as a parent sitting there, and I was also trained as a therapist, and I did the therapy as well for the first year, and I know there are details that you don't remember, and you manufacture these hypotheses about why you think things are the way they are. So what I wanted to do, and what Julie observed as an opportunity here, was to figure out a way to facilitate the discussion. And the key here was to allow us to be able to collect information in such a way that it was easy to build artifacts that would be able to be an anchor for this discussion of these collaborative meetings. So what we wanted to do was to somehow augment the therapy sessions itself. And we see a little clip in the upper right-hand corner here of what the therapy session looks like. You have someone sitting down at the table and the child across the table, and you have a number of objects you bring onto the table that you're performing with. So we want to figure out how we can leverage that activity, don't change it too much, and allow us to get a richer artifact of the recording that's going on. So we did two things. First, we put a microphone on the therapist and tried to listen for the various cues that they were using to tell the child to do something. They're trained to say very specific phrases. In fact, it's on the sheet, the data sheet that they're using, saying, say this to the child. So it's a fairly structured protocol that you can try to leverage. At the end of any trial that you're taking data on, you're also told to write down on a piece of paper what happened, your evidence of the success or lack of success. So you have two activities that are a natural part of the therapy that if you can capture or detect those effectively, you can use those as indices into the actual therapy itself. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the actual system that we used to give you an idea of what happens. We were using the Enoto technology, writing on the piece of paper, so they could use natural markings with pen and paper that they were used to already. But because the Enoto technology allows you to know when and where you wrote on a piece of paper, you could use that, leverage that information to more automatically generate the data that's needed to produce these kinds of graphs. So they would dock the pen at the end of a session, it would suck up all the data, and it would automatically generate these kinds of graphs that people could look at. So I'm now going to show you how you can jump between three different levels of discussion that really facilitate the kind of conversation going on. I'm showing here a particular program being shown on vocal imitation. You're asking the child to repeat the phrase "to." And when you hover over any given data point, it automatically drives down to the evidence that was generated from the writing on the piece of paper. So that's automatically given to you. You can see different shaped icons to represent the different individuals. So we have the ability to go from the trended data down to the data that was on a single sheet. But the interesting thing that you can do beyond that is I noticed there are two different consecutive sessions here where the child had very different kind of performance. And whereas I can look down here and say, oh, there was only one trial there, but it was independent, and I come down here and say, oh, there were a few trials and it wasn't so independent. That's all I get out of this particular view. But the next thing I can do is pull up a view from that particular, highlighting those columns and saying, let me view those sessions. And now I can pull up a way to be able to index into the video more easily and to be able to browse what was actually happening during the therapy sessions itself. And I just want to have a very simple demonstration to you here. The sound actually isn't all that important. But you'll see this is an example of a successful trial. And I'll just pause that so we can see the particular therapist, and we'll go up to the other therapist and we'll take a look at one of the trials that wasn't successful, and we can play that. And playing it and watching what happened might be interesting, but I hope it's relatively obvious to you in the audience. If I flick between these two different video sessions, you should be able to detect something that's obviously different between those two different settings. Right? The location of the child relative to the therapist is different. And because it is so easy to jump to these particular situations, that kind of information pops out to a group of people sitting around a table discussing what's going on. In addition, it's a little less obvious, but if we were to play this more, there's a TV over here in the corner in this particular video, and it's on in this therapy session. It's not on in the other therapy session. So there's some other distractions that are going on. And simply making it easy for people to get to that video and the relevant portion of the video made a big quantitative and qualitative difference in how you conduct those particular therapy sessions. Okay. We've extended the ABERIS system to look do it in school settings as well, but I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. We're still, this is a deployment that was done at the University of Washington, and we're still analyzing the data there, but we're trying to see how you might support collections of people simultaneously taking data in a school setting for a particular child and allowing them to more often reflect on the data that they collect in a fairly hectic and demanding environment. What I want to do now is move from that example of support for a specific well-structured therapy to a different setting where you don't have as much structure and predictability about what the situation is you'd like to review later on. So we'll look at the care log system, and this is one significant chunk of Jillian Hayes' thesis, and I couldn't fit on this slide all the different references that Jillian has for this work, so she advised me that it was probably best to just list her thesis, which is now, as soon as I sign my name on the dotted line next week, is now officially approved at Georgia Tech. The idea behind here is you're trying to collect rich behavioral information in unstructured settings. And the technical key, which is not that difficult, very simple to understand, is often you observe a relevant behavior occurring in an environment and you realize that you'd like to view that after it's already happened. So what you'd like to have is the retroactive ability to store relevant information. So retroactive saving, or what Jillian refers to as selective archiving, was the technical key to being able to achieve this. There are a variety of different situations in which you might be able to use this selective archiving or retroactive storing. In a home situation, you might use it to, after the fact, collect precious moments from your child's life and be able to share it with a loved one or grandparents or friends. You might also want to take evidence of behaviors in homes and share it with professionals or therapists, pediatricians, to try to seek advice from them about how you might adjust to the particular behavior you don't understand. In school settings, that is the precise initial market that we were targeting, where you have behaviors that children have in special education settings that are very upsetting to the environment and prevent the child from having a valuable educational experience. And so what professionals do in schools is they try to give advice to teachers to help them understand why a behavior is occurring, what's happening that's intrinsic to the classroom, or something that the teacher may be consciously or unconsciously doing that is impacting this behavior in a negative way, and how might they go about eradicating the behavior by intervening or doing something different in the classroom setting. But in order to do that, you have to provide direct observation of a number of different examples of the behavior, so someone can step back from those examples and try to figure out what's similar across them, so that they can formulate a hypothesis about the function behind the particular behavior. That's at the essence of what's called in behavioral psychology a functional behavior analysis or functional behavior assessment. So we want to use this technology to support the direct observation portion of an FBA. And what we did is a fairly ambitious study that was done with the support of a startup company and some government SBIR funding. We chose a school in the Atlanta area, special needs school not too far from Georgia Tech, and they had a number of classrooms, and in each of the classrooms of interest we placed cameras in the four corners of the room, so you had a variety of different perspectives and you could basically see the entire room from at least one camera angle. We then gave the teacher this small device that's in the upper left there. It looks, somewhat like this particular device, just a small wireless triggering device, and they were told, once you understood what the behavior was you were targeting in this observation, whenever you see it performed by that child, simply press the button. This is contrasted with the traditional way of performing this observation, where if you saw the behavior occurring, you would have a piece of paper there with, and you'd write down the time and the location, and you check down what you thought was going on before the event and what was going on after the event. Well, that's okay if you're a behavioral consultant and it is your job to sit in a school and to observe what's going on. But the behavioral consultant can't do this for 100 schools simultaneously. So they often try to offload that responsibility onto the teacher or the parapro in the classroom. And they ask them, when the child starts to behave poorly, let's say it's a self-injurious behavior. So when the child starts banging his or her head against the side of a cabinet, you're to pick up this piece of paper, write down the time and the context, and then what the child was doing slightly before they started bleeding to death, and what happened slightly after the child started bleeding. And then you place that down and go attend to the child. So I clearly over-caricaturize what happened there, but you can see the motivation then becomes, well, if I'm going to record this information, maybe I'll just jot down the time and the date on that piece of paper, put it down, I'll go take care of the child because that is the teacher's responsibility. And then later that day, the next week, the morning before you have the IEP, that's the meeting with the teachers and the parents in the school about this particular problem, you fill out the 20 or so observations with all the information you think you remember. So we were trying to compare doing this technically facilitated direct observation, press a button and later on go to look at it, with the traditional paper-based one. I want to show you the system itself so you get an idea of the behaviors that someone, or what this enabled an individual to do. So this is an example of a functional behavior assessment that was being performed on a particular child. And when I say I want to view the data here, it's going to pull up a graph that shows you in a variety of ways the distribution of the incidents, all based on the time information. When I press the button, it gives me the time of day, and we use that information to provide a variety of different kinds of visualizations. One of the interesting things you can then do is I can click on a particular incident, and what it'll do is it'll pop up a view of the classroom at that particular time that shows the 4 different camera angles. It shows the antecedent, what was going on before, the consequent, what went on afterwards, and I can play back this video and I can mark the antecedents and the consequent behavior that I want. I can delete the video if I want and keep the ABC data, or I can keep the video around for someone else to do. So that's the basic idea behind what this technology enables you to do. Very simply press a button to indicate a relevant behavior, and then later on go back and see a lot of the evidence. It's not the same as being there, but it is a little richer record than just relying on your memory itself. And we had very favorable results from our first feasibility study, which was done on 8 different children randomly assigned to 2 different conditions. And we compared the pen and paper versus the CareLog FBA, and a very well done. It's detailed ad nausea in Jillian's thesis, and it will be coming to a publication to your neighborhood very soon, so I won't go into too much detail about that. I will, however, promote the fact that Jillian has been successful in convincing a company to commercialize this and make it available to schools and homes. And if you're interested, the company is called Caring Technologies, and I have a demo of the system on my laptop here I can show if anyone is interested. So let's go to the last research thrust here. And this is looking at the problem of early detection. And this one is the current passion of our research group. And why this makes me feel so good is because it's more than just my students working on this particular problem. We've been able to convince a number of other technologists that they have things that they can do in this particular domain, and I hope that becomes clear to you. But let's get to the motivation. Many people believe that the earlier you detect a developmental delay, the sooner you can put in place certain interventions, and the greater the likelihood that the child and the family will learn to cope with or overcome the hurdles that the developmental disorder provides. But most diagnoses today are made several years after the initial warning signs were there. So what a lot of people are trying to do is figure out how you might more quickly screen for developmental disorders and then put in place any kinds of interventions that might be needed. And you're really trying to help parents see and report these kinds of warnings. And it's an active campaign of the CDC. Their Learn the Signs, Act Early program has garnered a lot of attention over the last year and a half. And it's very clear that this applies beyond autism. It actually applies, I think, beyond just any kind of developmental delay. There are other reasons why you might want to do this kind of recording. One question you might ask, a question that my students often ask, is what about this is HCI research? Well, if you were fortunate enough to go to Julie Kientz's talk that was in the session prior to this this morning, she showed several takeaway points from the work she had done over the summer, looking at people's practices for recording developmental progress, and looking at both pediatricians, caregivers, family members, and their perspective on this problem. And she came away with these 3 major points. And if you look at the phrasing of those, they are inherently HCI problems. So we have a lot of people in our community who have worked for years on decision-making technologies. So early detection provides a very interesting opportunity to explore a specific decision-making process and how technology might facilitate it. She uncovered, as was probably not that surprising to anyone, that parents are very diverse in their attitudes, their opinions, their likes and their dislikes. Well, what do we call this in HCI? We say this is examining individual differences. So individual differences come to the fore in this particular problem. And also because we're all very busy and we're asking people in their home lives to do extra work. Well, no one wants to do that. So the key to this being successful is one of the mantras of ubiquitous computing. How do you embed into people's everyday practices things that give you additional information that might be useful? And furthermore, how might you do it in such a way that they would be motivated to do a better job of capturing the data you want? So this was actually presented earlier this morning, and there's a paper in the proceedings at this conference about that. So what's the technology goal here? Well, simply put, we're trying to figure out a better way to facilitate the early screening of developmental delay that might lead to a diagnosis. And one comment about that is if you look at current practices, they heavily rely on 2 things. One is they rely on the parents to report the evidence of adequate or not adequate developmental progress. And parents are notoriously bad at being able to effectively report on certain kinds of progress of their children. You might remember the first time your child performed a particular activity, like when they said their first word, but you'd have a hard time remembering or determining whether your child has a 100-word vocabulary or whether that 100-word vocabulary has stayed consistent over the last 2 or 3 months. In the video I showed of my son Aiden, I think at the very beginning of it, he's pointing at some paintings on the wall. So there is evidence that he did pointing. There's a little bit of evidence that he had something called shared perspective. He'd point at something, and then he'd look at whoever was near him to make sure that you were looking at the same object. Well, okay, so he exhibited that at 18 months, but when did he stop exhibiting that? Because even to this day, as a 10-year-old, he does not exhibit that capability. So at some point it was lost. And we're very bad at knowing even to look for these things and to look for when they stopped occurring. The other thing about how this screening are done is they rely on observations of a child, typically in clinical settings. You bring the child to a professional's office and they will run them through a series of kinds of tests, and they will observe the child in that setting. But a doctor's office is not home, and there are a variety of reasons why a child might behave differently, on the better or worse, in those kinds of settings. So what we're trying to do is figure out how we might gather a lot of the evidence that feeds these screening practices, and we're going to approach it in 3 different ways. First, we're going to talk about how might you embed some persuasive technologies that actually motivate parents and families to collect this information and actually be rewarded for collecting it. Then, more technically driven, is how might you use computer vision techniques to automate the analysis of video, and I'll show you why that's interesting. Furthermore, how do you augment the objects that we have in our everyday life so that they might inform people about how they're being manipulated? So let's talk about these persuasive technologies. And I want to emphasize here, this is another part of Julie Kientz's thesis work. I'm notorious for forcing my students to have 2 or 3 theses worth of work in their particular thesis. So this is about 1/3 of her thesis, and maybe we'll let her graduate. The observation that she's pushing in this particular vein of work is to look at the kinds of things we already have in our home lives. Baby calendars that people purchase to track relevant activities in their life, and they treat these calendars both as tracking devices but also as heirlooms, keepsakes that will remind you later on of your child's life. We often have a typical baby shower present is to give someone a baby monitor, which either uses audio or video to allow you to remotely monitor a child so that if there's a problem and you're not there, you can be alerted and you can then do something about it. Well, we're trying to figure out a way we might leverage those kinds of technologies to allow people to be able to, in a motivated way, provide better information to pediatricians and themselves to have greater confidence about the knowledge of the child's developmental progress, and also generate important or valuable keepsakes along the way. So the 2 specific ideas that we're pursuing now, and we'll be embarking on a study as early as this summer or early next fall, is to take the notion of the baby calendar and turn it into a proactive, interactive digital baby book that allows you to collect information of milestone achievement, allows you to add rich evidence like video, allows you to be able to go back and look at and update particular milestones, and automatically remind you about these things in a way that is not nagging, but also doesn't let you forget about particular things, and then supports certain practices like being able to give a pediatrician a list of milestones that have been checked and have that available instead of having to fill it out in the waiting room 5 minutes before you see the pediatrician at a 12-month well baby visit. The other idea is to take this notion of the baby monitor and say, well, look, this is a little box, it's powered, it's usually put near the child. Well, that's like a computing device. Let's embed it, enhance it with some other capabilities. Let's add the selective archiving capability to it. Let's allow people to more easily say, when I see something interesting, say, what does that relate to, so it can feed it into the digital baby book appropriately. And if done correctly, it's not that much more effort to interact with that than it was to use the typical audio or video monitor that you might already have. Okay, so that's the persuasive technology. So what are the things we think we could put into households to gather this kind of information? Now, what might you do with certain information that you collect automatically? There have been a number of studies over the last decade, 3 different places in the world that I know of, that have done retrospective video studies that show there is evidence as early as 9 to 12 months in looking at home videos that show there are indicators of autism that you should be able to or would be able to detect. So if you're looking for early screening, we can see evidence in people's home movies. And I think, oh, home movies, I did that once. So home movies provide a lot of data, but if you look at the way people do the analysis, it's extremely arduous. Computer science students out there, be thankful you are not psychology PhD students, because they go through HE double hockey sticks to get do annotation of their video data to answer one very simple question. Thousands of hours they spend looking at video, selecting the relevant portion to view, and then going through it and coding and microcoding it with particular semantics about what's going on, all to answer a particular question like, is there an early sign for autism in this collection of people? It's arduous and it's mostly manual. So this is my kind of computer vision expert's dream. And I emphasize my kind because not all computer vision folks care about doing things in the real world. But I care. The 2 things that you might be able to do is automatically extract scenes of relevance that someone could look at, and then beyond that you might be able to do some annotation to say what's going on in that particular scene. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, we go to our favorite technical repository, YouTube, and we extract baby videos. And if we look at this particular video, I'm going to talk over it. You can see things are happening. It's about a 5-minute clip. And there's some very interesting events that are occurring. And if I were to go through and watch this, I could annotate a name-calling detection that's occurring, a reaching phenomenon that's occurring, and a clapping phenomenon that's occurring. And I could pull those clips out and I could hand them to other people to take a look at. That takes me time to extract it. So what you'd like to be able to do is to say, okay, feed me the raw video. Now I'm going to show you what the actual responding to name calling scenario is.
Katie.
Right? The name Katie was called and the child looked. I can look for an example of reaching for objects to see if it's done appropriately. And I can look for an example of a child trying to clap hands.
Maybe put your bit back on. What do you think? Clap hands?
Right? So those were 3 clips of relevant behavior that were extracted out of a much longer video, and I can now feed that to people to either manually look more closely at what's going on or do other kinds of automated analysis for it. And I think that's a wonderful target for people wanting to do computer vision work to try to handle, and it is the topic of, I forgot to mention, I think, Ping Wang, who is a PhD student at Georgia Tech, a student of Jim Ray, who's taking this on as her thesis topic. The next one, how might you augment objects and understand what's going on with them? Well, first of all, why would you want to do it? Well, one of the gold standards for the diagnosis of autism is something called the ADOS, where there are a variety of toys and a variety of scenarios that a professional, who you pay an awful lot of money to, does an evaluation of a child to determine whether they are showing appropriate forms of social interaction and play. So the question here is, can you instrument those objects to get some of the information that you pay an awful lot to the professional in a clinical setting to do? So this is the work that Tracy Weston, who's one of Thad Starner's PhD student, is taking on for her thesis. And the idea here is to take wireless sensors and wrap them up in such a way that you can embed them in particular objects. You show 2 examples here. On the right is a little Duplo block, so you'd be able to detect manipulation and stacking of these kinds of objects. On the left is a soft, cuddly toy that you might want to see how the child uses it for shared reference, or whether they grasp it appropriately or do exploratory play with it or not. So there are lots of things that you might want to observe in seeing a child interact with that kind of object. And the research question here is, with those embedded wireless sensors in there, can you get enough information to do what the humans were doing in terms of getting that information? What are the valuable questions to answer here? Well, you want to know how long is the infant engaging in a particular kind of play. There's a research group at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Grace Baranek is one of the senior researchers there. She's defined a 12-level taxonomy for different kinds of play and has made observations over the years that individuals with developmental disabilities tend not to advance beyond some of the lower stages of play. So if you could determine how long and whether a child is exhibiting a particular level of play, you'd have a very valuable screening instrument. How frequently do specific kinds of objects get played with? One of the important early warning signs for a child with these kinds of developmental disabilities is they spend more time interacting with an object than they do with the people around them. So can you determine when a child tends to focus more energy on the object itself? And is there a difference between exploratory play with that object and functional play with that particular object? These are hard questions, but I think some of them are amenable to relatively straightforward techniques with that sensor stream. In addition, without having to do automatic analysis, you can use objects in your environment to trigger behaviors that could be recorded so a professional or a parent might look at them later. So when I initially talked about the Smart Baby Monitor, I talked about the parent being able to indicate when something interesting happened. Well, maybe I want to detect what the child's like after they wake up from a nap, or when there's a mobile hanging over the crib, how do they start to play with it? So if you could detect certain activities like the batting of a particular mobile or the playing with a particular toy, and you could retroactively record what was going on before then, you'd have evidence of the child's play in a variety of different settings that could be fed into something like the digital repository of the baby's records and shared with parents and professionals. So that's 3 different examples I showed you of how we might use technologies in a home environment to try to support this holy grail of early detection. But I want to step back just a bit here before I finish and talk about how this notion of capture actually is valuable both to families and professionals wanting to do early detection or monitoring of intervention, but also I think shows great promise for trying to advance the science and understanding of autism itself. So The Georgia Tech work I've shown you here has this very common theme of automating the capture of a live event. You can think of that as a form of video-based imaging. Well, if you think about imaging and you look at the medical sciences, there are many examples where imaging has been used to promote or extend our knowledge in particular medical fields. So in orthopedics or in dentistry, when we introduced the notion of the X-ray, a way of doing a special kind of visioning, that transformed the practice and understanding of those fields. In cardiology, it was the echocardiogram, allowed us to see into heart behavior in a way that we weren't able to see before. In neurology, we use MRIs, fMRIs, CT scans. Those show us, reveal information that we don't otherwise have available to us, and they transform the sciences in those particular disciplines. So what I'm suggesting here is that the imaging of behavior might be able to transform the science and understanding of a discipline or a disorder like autism, making behavior, sorry for the misspelling there, behaviors a part of the medical record. Ultimately, what people are very interested in is developing what they call behavioral phenotypes that allow us to distinguish different elements of a disorder by their outward manifestation, as a way of feeding our knowledge and understanding from a genetic or cognitive perspective how those particular disorders are evolving. So I think there's a lot of hope here for using behavioral imaging as a way to promote science and to excite the researchers in autism, not just the parents and the professionals that are dealing with it clinically. There's also a lot more to discover. So I want to spend a little time not just blowing Georgia Tech's horn, but talking about some other work that's going on in this area. So at Northwestern, Justine Cassell and Andrea Tartaro, I think I saw Andrea down here, are working on a very interesting problem of how you might use virtual peers to somehow understand or facilitate the social growth of adolescents on the autism spectrum. Anne-Marie Piper, who was at Georgia Tech as an undergrad, was at Stanford doing a master's, has worked for 2 years at Leapfrog, is going to go to one esteemed HCI institution to continue her PhD. Did a very interesting problem, again with adolescents, trying to attack the problem of social behavior, but she used games as a way of being able to facilitate and use the specific technology of the Diamond Touch from Merle as the means of being able to do that. Carrie Karahalios, who is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, is looking at ways to be, in fact, her student Josh, I think, is here as well. Are you here, Josh? Yeah, he's right there. Is looking at ways you might understand language and socialization development in very young children using artifacts that might facilitate that kind of communication. Anybody notice a trend here? Okay, except for Josh and myself, and Schwedick, who actually wasn't really dealing with the autism one. So there's 3 of us, and the 20 other people that were involved here were women. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think women, computer scientists, are the ones that jump very happily towards problems that have meaningful resolutions. And I think it's a way for us to retain and promote the strong women we have in our discipline by allowing them to work on these interesting problems, or they do it anyway. And I really want you to realize that I really am just the front man for this, because Julie and Jillian and other people's work I've shown here, they're doing all the work and they're having a lot of the insights in here, and I'm the one who gets the social impact award, but you know, I'll take you out for dinner. This afternoon there's a SIG for technology and autism that's in room C1, and we'd welcome anyone to come and share their ideas or try to get motivated and understand how you might make a difference. One thing I can say to you is, beyond the computer scientists who look at this problem, the professionals, the researchers and the practitioners who claim not to know too much about the technologies are the most encouraging collaborators I have ever worked with in my life. It's probably because people who work with developmental disabilities are already, because they don't get too much economic compensation, are doing it for the good of it. And as I look out into the audience, I forgot to mention also Rana here from MIT, who's also worked, another woman, who works with Roz Picard, another woman, who's worked on ways to be able to determine notions of affect and conversation to support adolescents in understanding social interactions. So, I learned from watching Jim Foley's talk yesterday that there's no way I was going to do the acknowledgments at the beginning of the talk, because I didn't want to have to wipe away the tears throughout the entire talk. So I'm going to spend some time here, and I thought I'd soften you up and make you all cry so you wouldn't ask hard questions. And so I'm going to give some of the acknowledgments. So first, it's all in the family here. My father, who I mentioned before, who died in 1998, my mother is still alive, and she is the single largest inspiration for why everyone thinks I'm such a benevolent guy. Well, I'm just doing the kind of things that my mom has taught me I should do all my life. Megan Burke, who's my wife, is a professor of mathematics at Kennesaw State. You You can't get through the everyday struggles of dealing with special needs without someone like her. And of course, my two sons, Aiden and Blaze, who are the joy of my life, and Mary Catherine, who is my 3-year-old daughter, who I love that I got this award, but it pained me that I had to miss her birthday yesterday as a result of being here. But I saw her on Skype, and she opened her pink princess suitcase and loved that. So the other family. I'm so happy that Jim Foley got the Lifetime Achievement Award this year when I was also able to get an award, because it gives me a chance to stand up and say what everyone knows in their hearts, that he is the single most inspirational individual I've ever met in our area. And you can't discount how important it is to have someone who is able to subjugate their ego to let other people be successful. And the reason why we have a strong field in HCI is there are people that follow in his footsteps, and people like Jim, and also Beth follows in that tradition as well, and the entire GVU family. And in fact, it goes beyond GVU to the entire HCI community. I think a very supportive kind of community. I list up here the thing I'm most proud about, or what I want people to remember when I retire finally in a year or two. They remember the students, the people that sprung forth from my academic loins. And what I'd like to do here, sorry for that. Remember, I'm trying not to cry, so I use bad humor in place of it. So I'd like them all to come up here as I talk, and I want you to see them, because you've been seeing me for way too long, and it's important for them to get some recognition. So if Jillian and Julie would please come up here, I want you to see their faces and to know that this is where all the work is being done. I also would like Shwedek to come up. Two students who were not, or several people are not here, Ping Wang, Lamar Gardere, Arwa Tayyib Khan, Celeste. Celeste, I think, is actually here, so you can come on up, Celeste. I don't think Jamil is here either. So these are the students, and these people, and I don't know if Anind is out there or Jen is out there, Kai Trung, my students, people who have worked with me. Every year at Kai, we have an ABOUT academic family reunion. We had it last night. Anyone who has worked with me or worked with someone who has worked with me, we get together. And being from a family of 12, a blood family of 12, I'm a very inclusive individual, and it's wonderful to be able to share my accomplishments with you. Thank you. Thank you. I also need to acknowledge a couple of colleagues, Thad Starner and Jim Ray, who have become very passionate with me in the particular problem of early detection. Rosa Arriaga, who's a research scientist, and Julie Jacko. It was wonderful. I don't know where Julie is. Wonderful to have her introduce me, because she's been extremely supportive and is in no small measure the reason why I'm standing before you today. And Francois Sancourt, the three of us work in the Health Systems Institute at Georgia Tech, and that's been a very invigorating experience for me. I also need to tell you a little bit of the story here. This is the reason why students should do demos at conferences. UBCOMP 2003, a master's student of mine, David White, who actually, if you were here, David, you can stand up and be acknowledged as well, because he started all of this. David did a, yes. David did a Masters of HCI project with me at Georgia Tech as 2002 or so, David? I can't remember. And at the UBCOMP conference 2003, single-handedly pulled off a demo of a system we had done for the Walden Early Learning School as part of the Emory Autism Center. And not too many people wandered around at that demo, but one person did, and it was Terry Winograd. I don't know if Terry's here. I told him just the other day that he had a lot of the reason why I've been able to be successful in this area. Terry knew Dan Gillette, and you can stand now, Dan. Dan is the Director for Innovative Technologies for Autism for the Cure Autism Now Foundation, which is now part of Autism Speaks. And Dan and Portia Iverson drew me into the ITA committee, supported my work financially, but even more so supported my work in that he constantly lies to people about, oh, this is an engineer who gets it. So I'm predisposed to be liked by these people in the autism community, and I owe you a lot for the support that you've given me. Okay, so that's all. I can't tell you the number of times the last few days that people have come up to me, stopped me dead cold, and congratulated me. And it's not just an insincere, oh yeah, your congratulations. I can tell the heartfelt warmth that people have, and it's just the reason why this is the kind of community and why I was always attracted to doing HCI research, because people not only are smart and do interesting things, but they appreciate and encourage others to do things. And I thank Ben Schneiderman for pushing SIGCHI to have this kind of award so we can start to acknowledge this work and grow it even more in our community. So now that I've buttered you all up, you can throw your questions at me. There are microphones up here if you want, and we don't. It says here that we got 25 minutes left, which means I've already talked too much. We don't have to. We can spend as little or as much time as you want.
Hi, Barton Smith from IBM. So clearly, in these kind of let's say medically related areas, there are important issues of privacy and security. What aspects of that do you build into these, or include in these systems that you build?
Right. So thanks for asking that. Part of the evaluation we did at the school was an extensive study of the legal regulations in the school system for being able to capture and share video evidence. In the U.S., there are regulations called FERPA that protect the privacy of the academic record for the individual and on the sake of part of the family from being used for otherwise illicit means. It's the educational equivalent of HIPAA we have in this country. And we looked at a number of those regulations, and the fact of the matter is that the regulations allow quite a bit of slack in terms of what kind of information can be considered an educational record. But as soon as a video is considered part of your educational record, it becomes a protected part of the child's record, and the school is protected from being able to or requiring to share it. Because of that, and because we live in a very litigious society, many school districts don't allow recording in classrooms. That's the biggest legal, social impediment to doing what is otherwise being demonstrated as a very valuable means of supporting behavior analysis. And I only hope that the efforts of people like Jillian and Caring Technologies will demonstrate why video evidence recording in schools can be used for more than just the surveillance in public settings to prevent theft, but it can be used to help the behavior and education. So we do think about it fairly seriously, and I realize that there are hurdles, but we can overcome them. Sorry?
He's next.
You guys fight it out, I don't care. Ron?
Okay. Ron Becker, University of Toronto. This is beautiful work, and thank you, and congratulations. I have many questions. Luckily, you're going to give this talk in Toronto next week, so I can ask
Oh,
more
I was going to
then.
give a completely different talk.
Oh. But let me ask one that comes to mind. I had breakfast here with, as you know, I'm interested in work with people at the other end of the age spectrum with cognitive disorders, disabilities, et cetera. And I met here for breakfast with an individual who's been slogging in these areas for 20 years. And one of his concerns is that he doesn't see the education of health professionals, in his case, working with people with traumatic brain injury and other things, occupational therapists. He doesn't see the educational system for such people advancing to train people so that they can work in this area. And that would include, in his case, the ability to adapt and tailor technology for specific needs has been a very important part of his work. And I'm wondering to what extent you see that as manifesting itself in the domain you're working in, and to what extent you see the educational system of healthcare professionals, developmental psychologists, I'm not sure what people work with autism, responding to allow us to really move forward as much as we can and should in this area.
Yeah, I clearly have a limited perspective on this, but I'll share two observations. One, I don't think there's this wide chasm between the practices that these professionals have and how the technology might enable them and for them to understand how to use them. So I don't see this adoption as being a problem. And just as evidence, when we did the study at the school, though we took trained special education teachers as part of the care log study, we gave them what was, I think, about a half-day training in doing an FBA, and that was sufficient to get them to use the technology appropriately. So the training requirements are not that great if we're looking just at the professionals. But I think the interesting part of your question from my perspective, Ron, is how are we going to educate technologists to understand how to take their talents and apply them to these important problems? And there, I'll put a plug in for I think it's happening in other places, but the Health Systems Institute at Georgia Tech has taken on an explicit role of figuring out ways to be able to connect engineers with medical professionals. So this is a consortium of Georgia Tech, Georgia State, Emory, Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, doing programs that essentially do the cross-fertilization of technologists with medical health professionals. And I think it's in doing that that you're both going to train the medical professionals to be more savvy with technologies, but also get the technologists to understand what they need to do to answer the real medical problems in the world. And I think, and I hope there are other universities that are doing similar things.
I'm Howie Tamler from MDocs Incorporated, and I came here because my 7-year-old grandson is autistic, and I wanted to see if I could learn something that might actually help him. And all the stuff you've talked about seems to be, you know, work that's being done by your graduate students, which makes me think it's, you know, it's in a very early phase. It's being, you know, it's research, it's experimental, and so I'm wondering, is any of this stuff so well developed that it's actually a product that's on the market that somebody can buy and actually use now, or is it still in the stage where we need to do a lot more research and we don't know exactly what the applications are? Say, you know, like stem cell research, where it has a lot of promise, but nothing's been delivered yet.
Okay. Oh, you turned off that. If you could show the screen. I don't know if it'll launch right because I don't have a camera attached here, but this is a commercial version of the behavior imaging work that extends from Jillian's work, that is a fairly simple to use single camera ability to be able to capture and view evidence and share it with medical professionals. And we're now in the middle of a phase 2, or the beginning of a phase 2 SBIR grant to actually make this available to families. There's a home version of this that's available on the Caring Technologies website, and there'll be a professional version for schools available very soon. So I take very seriously this notion that if you want to have impact as a researcher, it's one thing to excite and communicate to this group, and I don't want to dismiss the importance of that, but the real impact here is getting it out in an affordable way to actual families. And I'm not alone in this particular endeavor. I'll point out Carl Smith, who's based in South Carolina, who created the Discrete Trial Trainer, which is a discrete trial computer program that he sells for no more than $99 to schools or to families, and does a lot of the effort of that form of discrete trial that I talked about, and makes it affordable and available to people. So these things are becoming possible, and it's through the support of organizations like Autism Speaks and Cure Autism Now that gets us to the point where we can do enough that then NIH and SBIR programs think we have enough done that they can seed us to do additional commercialization effort. Does that answer?
Sort of. Okay, so now I know there are a few products that can actually...
Yeah, and if there's anyone out there who knows some investors that would help me take the ABRIS work, the discrete trial work, to market, please come see me, because there are lots of people that want that.
Hi, my name's Allison, and I want to say thank you very much to you and your students for the work that you're doing. My sister is one of those dedicated professionals who's diagnosing disorders, and I've also worked in nonprofit healthcare before going back to school and during school for my computer science degree. And something that I feel in the back of my mind is that there must be a way, as the speaker talked about before, of connecting meaningful projects with computer science faculties. And when I was at the conference this week, I kept thinking that there must be a way that we could connect these ones and break it down and distribute it out through the rest of the classes. You know, the introduction algorithm classes could break down this portion of the problem and make a real connection. And I want to know what your thoughts are about this, aside from somebody like yourself with a personal interest, of course, working with the, you know, in Georgia, and what sort of things other universities could do.
Dan funded me to teach a class this semester on technology and autism, the purpose of which was to take a course that's already been taught and get it taught in other universities that are technology-minded. And I was the first guinea pig away from him teaching the course. So they're looking to see that. We will share our materials with a variety of people. So that's on a small scale trying to address this notion of how do we create the educational opportunities that allow people to pursue this domain. I've always loved the student design competition that Kai has, particularly when it has them address problems of significance. And it works best in my mind when those can be wrapped into the educational process at the institution. So I was fortunate to teach the Intro HCI course last year, and one of the project teams specifically chose that topic from the 2006 Kai competition and used the class to help them do a better job of it. So the way professional organizations can energize people is to leverage off the kinds of things that we already do and give them problems and incentive, like competitions that have recognition and awards, to get people thinking along those lines. And when you get students early enough, The difference isn't going to happen so much. There aren't going to be that many people like me advancing their career that go off to do these things. The better way to get at that is to get the people at the while they're undergraduates wanting to define their career and show them they can be successful in doing things that are also meaningful.
Thank you.
Hi, Anijo Matthew from Mississippi State. First of all, thank you for doing this, doing everything. Secondly, this is more of a comment than a question. And it seems that we all need to be entrenched in a problem to realize the significance of that problem. And when a researcher is entrenched in it, it sort of results in design solutions and design schemas that can be commercialized. I think the bigger thing for us as educators to do is to make students realize that we are all entrenched in some social problems every day. Poverty, homelessness, obesity, school children, all of these problems, healthcare, aging. And I think this this award and everything that you're doing sort of helps to bring those things to perspective and students to understand that you can be creative by doing these things and yet be solving a big issue than being, creating the next Xbox. Thank you.
Point taken.
Greg, first I want to tell you that I just loved your talk very much. It's very, very interesting, very intriguing. You touched a lot about technology. Oh, it's Hisham Kamil from UAE University. You touched a lot about technology, but I didn't hear you mentioning anything about the possibility of having, say, a computer-based program that perhaps could improve or be used to improve the level of, say, human-human interaction of these kids. Do you think that would be something viable, or you don't think that?
No, I completely agree with you, and I think one of the things that's missing in the style of work that we've been promoting at Georgia Tech is that it's not been focused on an intervention or something to support the individual. It's been more about the caregiver network and supporting information gathering. So that's why I tried to highlight some of the work done elsewhere.
Right.
So I'm showing here the work of at Northwestern, at Stanford, at Illinois, also at MIT with Rana's work, where they actually are looking at techniques to support the interaction and the socialization, things that are targeted more toward the individual.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Hao from National Taiwan University. I love your talk.
Thank you.
Really nice. So my question is whether your record-keeping tools monitor the parent-child interactions. I once spoke to an occupational therapist, and he told me that dealing with children, for them, are relatively easy, but teaching parents how to interact with the child correctly, especially sometimes when the child, they will just do something naughty, and most of the time the parents will just go, sometimes they will just lose control and start interacting with the child and not in the correct way.
We, of course, never do that, but others, I've heard, do that. So it's a very good point. In fact, a project I'm just itching to start doing, and I think with some of the new facilities that we have at Georgia Tech, we'll be able to explore. When I've talked to therapists, often what you do is you bring your child to the office, and the therapist interacts with the child. And maybe the parent's there, maybe the parent's observing somewhere else, and the therapist and the parent talk after the therapy. But if you talk to most therapists, the most effective therapies are ones that the parents understand and can essentially extend into the day. So that argues for a style of therapy where I don't take my child to the professional's office. I have the child in some setting where I'm interacting with them, and the therapist comes to me, whether that's they come directly to my home or through telemedicine technology, can essentially do remote teletherapy. They can be an observer on my shoulder explaining to me what's going on in a particular interaction that I'm doing. Or, if I can't have them there at that time, might I use the selective archiving to essentially grab a particular incident that occurred, share it with someone, and either over the phone or in person talk to them about what was going on there and let them essentially advise me. it brings up this very sensitive point about what happens if you're embarrassed by your behavior, and what happens if there's, God forbid, some element of child abuse, and you share that information. What's the responsibility of the therapist in that setting? You want to have an open, trusting relationship so that you can show someone, bear your wounds and your evil, so that someone can help you overcome them and do things that are best in the best interest of the child. But there are other social features that come to play there.
I have a personal interest, again, towards the other end of the spectrum in Alzheimer's disease, both because of the demographics and because I turned 65 in October, and also in multiple sclerosis because I have a sister with MS. MS strikes me as, in a way, very similar to autism in that it manifests itself in an incredible variety of ways. And I'm curious to what extent you've thought about the ability to extend the kind of work you've done into some of these areas. And I'll just mention one area of difference that I see. Children, of course, have no power, and we're used to recording them and doing whatever. But adults do, and there's this huge reluctance for recording, for observation, things like that, that characterizes our society, and it manifests itself in along with other things, in bizarre ways. Like, I've been waiting 40 years for good computerized patient medical records, and we still don't have it. I'm still hoping I'll see it in my lifetime, knock wood. But do you have any thoughts about how your research agenda and research approach might work either for MS or for mild cognitive impairment / Alzheimer's disease?
Right, so there were 2 points that I want to address quickly. One, the notion of extending this to different kinds of domains. You're obviously right. Recognize the context with which I came with it, and the next questioner is the motivation for this. We had been doing work for aging people at Georgia Tech, and there are lots of opportunities. Either you're healthy and you're just aging, or you're aging with the disability. There are lots of interesting opportunities there, and I wanted to look at the other end of the age spectrum because, as you pointed out, they're very interesting, different social tensions. The desire for you talked about older individuals not wanting to be recorded. Well, younger individuals are growing into autonomy. Older individuals are typically growing out of autonomy, and they're willing to give up certain things if it's always this balance for what you can get for what you give up. And it is true that people will give up a modicum of privacy if it means they're able to retain some level of respect or independence. And it's that balance that becomes very important. And it's a different kind of balance for children. I find that very fascinating because I would want the assistive technologies for the children to essentially be able to come away and essentially wean them from them, move them toward autonomy. And I had another point, but I'm going on too long, so we'll talk.
I would have follow-up, but I'll hold it for Toronto.
Good. We only ever get to talk at these kinds of settings, so go on, Beth.
Good. It's good to see you, Gregory. Congratulations
Thank you.
again. Just having talked to so many researchers who would like to follow in the footsteps of the kind of work that you've been able to do, it seems that much of this research in terms of addressing sort of real critical, let's say medical issues, falls between kind of the classic NSF style research, but because it somehow seems applied, however, it doesn't also fall into the clinical protocols associated with NIH research. Can you comment on what seems to be a quandary in this area, and have you seen progress in terms of identifying how we can have federal support for, I think, very admirable research such as this?
Right. So I think you know a little bit of my personal insight on this is where there's a will, there's a way. And don't ever write proposals to funding organizations for work you wouldn't otherwise do. And I think it becomes obvious when you write these kinds of proposals that whether you're committed to do the work or not. With respect to this falling between the cracks between NSF and NIH, I think once you learn how to write an NIH proposal the way NIH reviewers expect them to be written, things become much easier for you. There are a variety of ways you can go about doing that, having the right kinds of collaborators who can help you do this, or use a little money, hire a consultant. They're very good at helping you write proposals in the right way. I think NIH is very open to exploratory technology research as long as you can couch it in a way that shows you're moving toward what might lead to a clinical study. And NSF, I think, has always shown interest in being able to support exploratory. I think they probably don't demand enough in terms of clinical expertise, and I also don't think that they're so blinded that they would have a medical domain not be outside of NSF's purview. But you know, I've been fairly successful at getting funding, and by going through other foundations and companies as well. But getting something done first and doing it regardless of what funding agencies do, I think is the fundamental lesson for people out there who are going to have to struggle to pay their way soon. Austin.
Austin Henderson, Pitney Bowes. Greg, congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. On a different front, can you say anything about the way our profession and our interests play in the relationship and the work that gets done between caregivers? My father just died of Alzheimer's, and my brother felt tremendously supported by a community of people. And that was probably as important to the last years of my father's life as anything.
Right. So this is going a little bit beyond. If you look at what we tried to do initially, we were trying to support a kind of narrow form of communication across the caregiver network. So recognizing that being able to, in the case of autism, at least personally speaking, the parents play this role of coordinating across a lot of people, informal and formal. And what you need to provide, empower them to be able to share information to people who want to know, but for whom it's hard to just get them up to speed on things. There are lots of very interesting websites out there. I think CaringBridge is one of them. You can essentially set up places where you create a journal for a particular individual and other people can log in and see the update. There are lots of online communities and researchers in online communities. Jillian spent the summer at IBM Research looking at the problem of cancer patients and what kinds of resources and community support they provide. So a lot of these kinds of support mechanisms are there without anything that I do. Now the question is, what might some of this kind of technology research do to further enhance that kind of social networking and the online community support? I think it's a wonderful problem for people to look at. And I was talking to someone yesterday, first name's Scott, quadriplegic on the autism spectrum, and he's very interested in computational advocacy, which is essentially how can Joe Blow on the street see someone struggling with some piece of technology, like someone in a wheelchair trying to get through a door and having a hard time. How can you essentially take a clip of that and post it somewhere with information about who the person who's manufactured that door or who the owner of that restaurant is, so that people who see it can act by saying, you know, you should change this. So being able to use computational resources to facilitate advocacy. Because if I send you email and I say, click here and a letter will be generated to your senator supporting this particular thing, it's a very easy thing for you to be able to follow along that, as opposed to saying, well, call your senator or write and tell them things. So I think there are ways we can use computation out in the field to facilitate this notion of advocacy. Thank you.
Hi, Gregory. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I'm as much of a fan of you and your students as I've ever been. I actually have a comment and a request. My first comment was, if you hadn't had a chance to see the work that Jeff Hare presented yesterday with Martin Wattenberg and Fernando Villegas, I thought that might be something interesting for you to consider for the early detection about how communities together can look at visual data and do sense making on that. So I thought that might be of interest. And secondly, because I know this is not a moment at which any of your students want to embarrass you, and because you've already signed my dissertation and you can't take that back.
That's right.
I was wondering if you could make good on your request to show some embarrassing video clips of yourself.
This, I don't know how much time you guys have, so I will, yeah, other people can leave if there's no other question. I will launch the Family Video Archive and I will show you embarrassing footage of Gregory. It does take about 30 seconds or so to launch. But I know exactly where to go. Anybody have a joke? By the way, Elaine, for my 40th birthday, my students gave me a collection of embarrassing videos from the Family Video Archive, so they're not too... I should probably also show you guys what they did to my office last week. Okay. Go on, ask the question. I can, Scott. Oh yeah, I can listen to you and find this while you're talking.
All right, that sounds good.
Scott Saponis from the University of Washington. So I have
Nice to meet you, Scott.
I have 2 questions, very related. So in all this work, it looks like you've done a lot of work in early detection and therapy using automated capture and access and semi-automated analysis. So 2 questions. One, going into the future, what are you hoping to see from the rest of the CHI community for social impact in the medical sciences? What do you want to see the rest of us doing? And then the related question is, what's next for your group?
Ron asked this question about had I thought about applying my technologies. The end of this clip is the interesting part, and it's coming very soon, where my skills as an exhibitionist are revealed. You can also, I can pull up short shorts in basketball as well. My response to Ron, which I didn't say, was I think I shouldn't be the one who's going to now take this approach and apply it to other domains. I could do that, but I'm limited. I have things I'm committed to doing. I should facilitate other people being able to apply these techniques and these ideas to those different problems. I should facilitate someone else out in the audience there next year or 4 or 5 years from now getting a social impact award because they're inspired to do those kind of things. What's the next thing my group is doing? Well, there's certain things we're doing right now that I'm very excited about, because one of the keys to being able to do this early detection from a public health perspective is to get it into every home in the US. So from a ubiquitous computing perspective, and you're a ubiquitous computing expert, having been trained by one of the best as an undergraduate in ubiquitous computing, went to Georgia Tech. Looking at what technologies actually can be effectively deployed in any home. And this is where I think, though it's not directly targeted to autism, this is where Swetik has really excelled. Developing technologies for positioning and sensing in the home that require very little infrastructure, very little expense, very little deployment time to actually achieve them, and they leverage off infrastructure that most every home has, and that's the power line. And I'm very excited about the opportunities for being able to do that to support a wide variety of applications, including, taking a baby monitor that's plugged in something and the baby monitor knowing automatically where it is in the house. It's a simple example of being able to add additional metadata to all this information. If you look at what I do in this family video archive, I have a way of being able to annotate who's in the scene, where is it, when was it going on, what's the event that's going on. But very few people are going to spend the time to do that. But being able to get some of the lower level metadata can lead to good predictions about what the higher level information is. So I think these kind of ubiquitous sensing technologies, and I truly mean ubiquitous, ones that you can, the research contribution is to demonstrate that it can be deployed easily and effectively over a wide area. That's the area that we're working on now that I'm very excited about. And I won't tell you the other things because, you'll find out about them. So, that's it. I will just pull up here some embarrassing video of me playing basketball and you can all leave. You really can leave. I'm just doing this for my own enjoyment. This is when I was a contemporary of Michael Jordan, because we both went to the same high school basketball camp. I'm not kidding, we did. There we go. Here's yeah. That's me kicking the ball out of bounds. I'm number 13, I think, right there. No, I'm number 5.
All right. While you're all
There you go.
watching Gregory and his stellar basketball skills, I want to say thank you to him for this work. He's been an inspiration to me and to a lot of people in this room, and I hope that you'll all join me in giving him one more round of applause as we leave.